They said she didn't look tough enough to be a real operator. 5 Bud recruits in their 20s, loud, confident, brimming with the arrogance that only comes before a fall, had cornered Lieutenant Bryn Takakota in the mess hall that night. The fluorescent lights hummed above metal trays and cold food, and the ocean wind pushed faintly against the windows. They thought she was just another liaison officer, one of those paper pushers who wore a uniform but never touched the dirt. They were wrong. 40 seconds later, 3 of them were on the floor. One was gasping for air, and the fifth, the tall one from Texas, was staring up at her in disbelief, trying to process how a woman half his size had dismantled his entire crew without breaking a sweat. What they didn't know, what nobody at that base had been told, would change everything about how they saw her. Because Bryn Takakota wasn't just another officer, she was a Navy SEAL. The whispers started before the adrenaline had even faded. The mess hall, usually filled with laughter and steel utensils clattering, went silent except for the sound of boots scraping against tile. Eyes followed her as she picked up her tray, calm, expression unreadable. She walked past the stunned recruits, past the watching crowd, and left through the double doors like nothing had happened. But in her chest, her heart was pounding, not from fear, not from triumph, but from something else, something colder. She'd been here before, in different rooms, under different eyes, forced to prove she belonged in a world that told her she didn't. The next morning, the incident spread across the base faster than wildfire. Every hallway conversation seemed to carry her name. Some called her reckless, some called her dangerous, most just called her that woman in the mess hall. But if you'd asked Bryn what really happened that night, she'd have told you it wasn't about pride or proving anything. It was about principle. Respect. Something she'd learned long before the uniform, long before the trident. Bryn Takakota grew up on the Colville Reservation in eastern Washington state, under skis that felt too wide and winters that bit through the bones. Her grandfather, a Marine Corps scout sniper who had fought in Vietnam, raised her and her younger brother after their parents split. He never talked much about the war, but he carried it with him in the way he moved, slow and deliberate, in the way he watched the horizon like it was still hiding an enemy. He'd wake before dawn, walk the ridgeline, and teach Bryn the kind of lessons that never came from books. Patience, he'd say, kneeling beside her in the forest. You breathe with the earth, you don't fight it. When she was 14, he took her hunting for the first time. They hiked for hours through snow and silence until they found the mule deer 300 yards away, broadside, unaware. Her hands trembled as she raised the rifle. He put a hand on her shoulder, steady, and whispered, "Don't rush the shot. Let it come to you." The echo of that rifle shot rolled through the valley. When the deer fell, he didn't cheer. He just nodded once and said quietly, "You've got the hands for it." She never forgot that. By 21, Bryn had a degree in exercise physiology from Washington State University and a runner's body that had been built through pain, middle-distance track, 438-mile. But the stopwatch didn't challenge her anymore. She wanted something harder, something that would scrape her soul down to what was real. So she joined the Navy. In 2019, when the SEAL pipeline opened to women, she volunteered. 218 candidates started that class. 3 were women. By the end of Hell Week, only 1 remained. Sorry. It wasn't just the cold that broke people. It was the silence between the cold. The moments when the body screamed and the mind whispered, "Quit." She didn't. Not when the logs tore her shoulders apart. Not when the instructors ripped her regulator underwater, tying her air hose in knots just to see if panic would take over. Not when the sand gritted in her teeth during miles of soft-sand runs that felt endless. She didn't quit when the men around her whispered she didn't belong. By April 2021, she graduated Bud 6 months later. She earned her trident. She never made a speech. She never celebrated publicly. She just folded her uniform that night, placed the trident on her nightstand, and stared at it under the dim light, wondering if it would ever mean equality or if it would just be another thing she'd have to defend. Her first deployment came in 2022, Iraq, attached to a Special Operations Task Force. Raids against ISIS remnants, house to house, dust and chaos. She wasn't given the easy tasks. She didn't want them anyway. She saw friends die. She saw villages flattened by decisions made far above her rank. But she also learned something deeper, that courage wasn't loud. It didn't shout or boast. It just kept moving forward when no one was watching. Syria came next, a small advisory team, training Kurdish fighters. It was quieter but not safer. She'd been on point one night in Deir ez-Zor when the alley erupted in gunfire, AKs shredding the walls around her. She hit the dirt, called out the contact, returned fire. When it was over, her senior chief, the same man who'd once doubted her, put a hand on her shoulder and said, "You handled that like a veteran." She didn't reply, just nodded. That was enough. 8 months later, she was back in Coronado, the liaison officer now, coordinating between SEAL teams and joint commands. It was supposed to be routine, quiet, away from the fight. But the fight always finds you, one way or another. The mess hall incident happened on a Tuesday in October 2024. Long day, endless meetings. She just wanted dinner and silence. The room was crowded with junior sailors and officers scattered near the windows, their laughter bouncing off the walls. She sat alone in a corner, uniform crisp, posture straight, a quiet presence that didn't invite conversation. Then the 5 recruits walked in. Fresh from phase one of Bud S, still high on survival, on the illusion that toughness was noise and size was power. The Texan spotted her first. He nudged his buddy and whispered something that made them all grin. They walked over, their boots heavy, their confidence heavier. "You lost, ma'am?" the Texan asked, his voice dripping mock respect. She didn't look up. "No. This mess hall for operators," he said, puffing his chest. "Not admin." Laughter followed, nervous, ugly. She set down her fork and looked at him. Her eyes were calm, unreadable. "You should walk away." But he didn't. He leaned in closer, said something about how she didn't look tough enough to be a real operator. One of his friends muttered, "Women don't belong in the teams." The air shifted. Conversations around the room slowed. Even the hum of the lights seemed quieter. And when another recruit added something cruder, she stood. 5'6", 135 pounds, surrounded by 5 men who could each outweigh her by 70. The Texan grinned, thought it was over. It was. Her right hand came up fast, deflecting the grab toward her shoulder. Before the first could react, her left elbow drove into his solar plexus. Air left his lungs in a ragged wheeze. The Texan lunged. She sidestepped, caught his arm, used his momentum, sweep, pivot, drop. He hit the tile hard. Another came from behind. She dropped her weight, twisted, and drove her knee into the outside of his leg, a sharp crack where nerve met bone. He folded instantly. 4 down, 1 froze. The 5th took a step back. Bryn straightened, breathing steady, not angry, just focused. "Lesson over," she said quietly. "Walk away." The silence that followed was thick enough to choke on. Then a voice broke it. Senior Chief Garrett Moss, instructor, 12 years at Bud S. He'd seen it all. He walked up slowly, scanning the wreckage. "Lieutenant," he said evenly, "rank and community." "Lieutenant Takakota," she replied, "Naval Special Warfare." His expression didn't change, but the air did. He nodded once. Understood. Then to the recruits, "Report to the command duty office, 5 minutes." They scattered like shadows. When Bryn left that room, she wasn't thinking about consequences. She was thinking about her grandfather. Respect isn't given, it's earned through action. That night she sat on the small balcony of her quarters, the ocean whined cold against her skin. She could still hear the silence of that moment, the disbelief in their eyes, the pause before realization. She didn't hate them. They were young, arrogant, lost in the idea of what strength looked like. She'd been surrounded by men like that her entire career. But she wondered if, just for a second, one of them had understood the truth. That quiet doesn't mean weak, and restraint doesn't mean submission. She looked at the trident on her desk through the window, the symbol that had cost her everything and given her nothing she hadn't already earned. And somewhere in the darkness, her grandfather's voice echoed softly in her mind. "Steady now, Bryn, you've got the hands for it." The next morning would bring questions, meetings, official reports. Some would call her brave, others reckless, but none of that mattered. Because Bryn Takakota had lived long enough to know, in the Navy, in the world, in life, dignity doesn't announce itself. It simply acts. The morning after the mess hall incident began with silence, not peace, but that uneasy calm that comes before the storm. When Bryn woke, the Pacific fog had rolled in over Coronado, wrapping the base in a gray haze. She sat on the edge of her bunk, uniform folded neatly beside her, boots polished so clean the light caught on the tips. The trident glinted faintly under the lamp. For a long moment, she just looked at it. That small piece of metal, gold, simple, heavy with expectation. It had opened doors and closed hearts. It had made her both a symbol and a target. Somewhere outside, morning PT whistles echoed, distant shouts from trainees hitting the surf zone. She could picture them, the same 5 faces from last night, drenched, exhausted, stripped of the swagger they'd worn like armor. She wasn't angry, just tired. By 700, the summons came through. "Lieutenant Takakota, report to Commander Dalton's office. SEAL Team 7 HQ, 900 hours." She'd been expecting it. The corridors of the Naval Amphibious Base were familiar, almost comforting in their order, gray walls, framed photos of operators past, the faint scent of coffee and gun oil. Bryn walked with her hands behind her back, measured steps, no hurry. The stairs followed again. They always did. A quiet woman walking through a world built by loud men. She paused outside the door that read Commanding Officer, SEAL Team 7, and took a slow breath. Then she knocked once. "Enter." Commander Eric Dalton looked up from behind his desk, tall, early 50s, silver hair, the kind of presence that filled a room even when he said nothing. Beside him stood Senior Chief Garrett Moss, the man who'd seen everything in the mess hall the night before. "Lieutenant Takakota," Dalton said, his tone steady, unreadable. "Take a seat." She did. Dalton leaned back slightly. "You've had quite a night." Bryn said nothing. He opened a folder, glanced down at the report. 5 Bud S candidates, physical altercation, 3 treated by corpsmen, 2 dropped from training pending review, and you, Lieutenant, walked away without a mark. He looked up. "That about right?" "Yes, sir." He nodded once. "Senior Chief Moss here tells me you showed exceptional restraint." Moss spoke for the first time. His voice was low, gravelly, like the ocean against rocks. "You could have broken bones, ma'am. You didn't. That says something." Bryn met his eyes. "They didn't give me reason to." A pause. Then Dalton set the folder down. "You didn't list your SEAL qualification in your current personnel file." Bryn's jaw tightened. "No, sir." "Why?" She hesitated, not out of fear, but calculation. How to explain something that never fit neatly into words. "I wanted to do my job," she said finally, "without the noise that comes with the title." Dalton studied her, fingers tapping lightly on the desk. "You earned the trident, Lieutenant. You bled for it. Why hide it?" "Because, sir," she said quietly, "it's easier to be underestimated than to be resented." The words hung there, raw, honest, undeniable. Moss's eyes softened. Dalton leaned forward. "You think you're the first to face that kind of resentment?" "No, sir." but you might be the first to carry it with that much silence." Bryn didn't respond. Dalton's tone shifted, lighter but edged with meaning. "You've got quite a record, Lieutenant. Iraq, Syria, 2 deployments, 1 commendation for valor under fire. Senior Chief Moss tells me your after-action report from Deir ez-Zor reads like a case study in composure." Moss nodded. "She called the contact, returned fire, coordinated the evac, cool under pressure. Operators twice her size have lost their heads in less." Dalton turned another page in the file. Bronze Star recommendation, unprocessed. Bryn blinked once. "Sir, I wasn't aware." "Of course not," Moss said, half smiling. "You don't check your own awards board." Dalton closed the folder. "The Navy needs operators like you back in the field, Lieutenant. Not behind a desk pushing paper. What you did last night wasn't just about discipline. It reminded people what quiet strength looks like. I'd like to see you back on an operational team." The words landed heavy. Bryn had spent the last 8 months trying to disappear. After years of headlines, scrutiny, the constant question of should women be here. She learned to live in the shadows of her own accomplishment. Now they were asking her to step back into the light. She looked up slowly. "Sir, with respect, you think the teams are ready for that again?" Dalton's expression didn't waver. "Readiness isn't the issue, Lieutenant. The question is, are you?" She didn't answer right away. 8 months of silence had been a kind of peace, but not the kind that healed, more like hibernation. She'd hidden behind routine, behind professionalism, pretending she didn't miss the rush of mission briefings, the quiet brotherhood of men who judged you only by your actions, not your gender. Maybe it was time to stop hiding. She exhaled slowly. "Yes, sir, I'm ready." Dalton smiled faintly, the kind of rare smile that meant something. "Good. Moss will handle the transfer paperwork. You'll be assigned to SEAL Team 3. Give it 6 weeks." He stood, offered his hand. "Welcome back, Lieutenant. It's good to have you in the fight again." She rose, shook his hand firmly. "Thank you, sir." As she left the office, Moss called after her, "Lieutenant." She turned. "You earned every inch of that trident," he said quietly. "Don't let anyone make you smaller to fit their comfort." Bryn gave a small nod, the kind that said she heard him, really heard him, and walked out. The weeks that followed blurred together. Physical requalification, range drills, dive refreshers, long hours in the gym. Her body remembered what her mind had tried to forget, the rhythm of training, the language of precision. Each day she pushed harder. She had to. Some of the men in her new unit, SEAL Team 3, had read about her. Others only knew the rumors. Few said anything to her directly, but the undercurrent was there: curiosity, doubt, the silent calculation of how much she could really handle. Bryn didn't talk much. She let the work speak. She showed up first, left last. Shot cleaner, swam farther, carried weight without complaint. She didn't ask for respect. She just built it piece by piece, one silent action at a time. But at night, when the compound lights dimmed and the chatter faded, she'd sit by the docks and watch the lights shimmer on the black water. She'd think about her grandfather, about what he'd say if he could see her now. She could almost hear his voice again. "You don't prove your worth by fighting everyone, Bryn. You prove it by standing where others fall." 6 weeks later, she boarded the C-17 bound for Djibouti. Destination: the Horn of Africa. Her first mission back wasn't supposed to be complicated. A direct-action raid targeting a high-value individual in southern Somalia. Intelligence suggested a small cell of insurgents, minimal resistance. But things rarely go as planned. Night operations blurred into heat, noise, and adrenaline. They breached the compound under moonlight, clean, precise. Within minutes, the objective was secure. Then came the exfil. The open desert stretched out before them. Dust, wind, and silence until it was. From the north, the mechanical roar of a technical, A pickup mounted with a heavy machine gun broke the night. The first burst of fire shredded the dirt near their feet. The air turned metallic with dust and cordite. Bryn hit the ground, rolling into cover behind a low berm. Her heartbeat slowed, not sped, the way it always did when chaos struck. She lifted her Mk-18, scanned, saw the tracer fire cutting through the darkness. "Contact North Ridge, 50 cal," she called, voice sharp, clear. The team shifted instantly. The lieutenant commander in charge, Ramirez, ducked beside her. "Can you mark it?" She flipped her laser, painted the target, called in coordinates for air support. The gunfire intensified, rounds chewing through dirt and stone. But Bryn stayed still, breath steady, focus absolute. Minutes felt like hours. Then the distant thump of inbound ordnance. A-10 strike. The ground shook and the gunfire stopped. Silence returned. Ramirez turned to her, panting. "You just saved us a body count, Lieutenant." She nodded once, no pride in her expression, just the quiet acceptance of duty done right. When they returned to base, the story spread. The whispers this time were different, not about gender, not about what she looked like, but about what she'd done. The woman who had earned her trident had just proven again that she didn't need to explain herself to anyone. A month later, she got the message. Her grandfather had passed. She took emergency leave, flew home to Washington. The rain greeted her like an old friend, cold, endless, honest. At the cemetery, her younger brother handed her a folded flag. "He asked to be buried with this," he said. Inside was a photo, Bryn in uniform, trident pinned to her chest, exhaustion and pride etched into her face. She stood there in the rain, not crying, not speaking, just breathing. In the distance, a single hawk circled the tree line. She could hear him again, as clear as that first hunting trip years ago. "Respect isn't given, Bryn. It's earned through action." She looked down at the headstone, her voice a whisper. "I'm still earning it, Grandpa." When she returned to Coronado, something inside her had shifted. The noise, the whispers, the judgment no longer mattered. She knew who she was. And she finally understood that strength wasn't about proving others wrong. It was about living right, quietly, steadily, with purpose. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts. They trusted her now, or at least they said they did. 3 months into deployment with SEAL Team 3, Bryn had earned something that no speech, no medal, no promotion could buy: quiet respect. The kind that didn't come in words but in glances during briefing rooms, in the way men nodded at her during gear checks, in how they stopped questioning her place on the team. She didn't celebrate that. She didn't need to. In her world, respect was like air, invisible, vital, and easy to lose. It was late November, somewhere along the Somali border. The night was thick with heat and static. Bryn sat on the tailgate of a Humvee, running a final check on her Mk-18 rifle. The moon hung low, a dull silver disk behind thin clouds. "LT," Ramirez called, voice cutting through the dark. "We move in 5." She nodded, shouldering her gear. They were targeting a mid-level cell leader responsible for ambushes on U.S. convoys, routine, at least on paper. But Bryn knew better. There's no such thing as a routine raid when human lives hang in the balance. They rolled out in a convoy of 3 vehicles, engines rumbling low, headlights off. The desert stretched endless around them, an ocean of dust and shadow. Bryn sat in silence, headset pressed tight, pulse steady. It wasn't nerves, it was focus. She learned to live in that thin space between stillness and violence, the seconds before chaos, when everything is clear. When they hit the village perimeter, everything happened fast. They breached the compound walls, cleared each room with methodical precision, movement, light, silence. The target was caught alive, kneeling in the corner, hands trembling, eyes wide. Mission success. They radioed exfil. Easy to easy. Bryn felt it, the prickle along the back of her neck, that instinct that had saved her more than once. Then came the first explosion. An IED buried beneath loose earth erupted behind the last Humvee, a shockwave slamming through the night. Contact, rear vehicle hit. Smoke and dust swallowed everything. Bryn dropped low, rifle up, scanning the rooftops. A second blast, incoming small arms fire. The air filled with screams, static, and the raw percussion of combat. Ramirez were taking fire from the West Ridge. Copy that, suppress and move. Bryn sprinted between cover, rounds snapping overhead. The world collapsed into sound, gunfire, shouted commands, the metallic tang of fear. A wounded operator was down, legs shredded. Bryn crawled to him through dirt and broken stone, grabbed his vest, dragged him behind a wall. "Stay with me, Davis," she yelled, pressing her hand to the wound. Blood pulsed hot through her fingers. "Doc." No answer, just more fire. Bryn's mind split, half on triage, half on survival. She tied off the leg with her belt, then reached for her rifle again. "Ramirez, I need air support, grid 294. Her voice was steady, commanding, no panic. 30 seconds later, the thunder rolled in. The A-10 strike hit the ridge, cutting the night open in fire. When the dust cleared, silence returned, thick, heavy, unforgiving. They lost one man that night. Davis survived barely. Bryn didn't cry, she didn't speak. Back at base, she sat alone by the armory steps, helmet in her lap, staring at her blood-stained gloves. The moonlight reflected off the wet concrete, and she thought about how quickly life disappears, how 1 second someone's beside you, laughing, and the next there's nothing but an echo. Ramirez found her there. "You did good out there," he said quietly. She looked up. "We still lost him." "That wasn't on you." Bryn didn't reply. Ramirez sighed. "You can't carry every death like it's yours, Lieutenant." She gave a small, tired smile. "Then why does it feel like I do?" He didn't have an answer. That night she couldn't sleep. She sat by her cot, cleaning her weapon out of habit more than necessity. Each motion was methodical, ritualistic. Wipe, oil, reassemble, repeat. The sound of distant generators filled the night, a low hum that never stopped. She glanced at her reflection in the dark window. The woman staring back looked older than 29, eyes heavier, shoulders tighter. She thought about the mess hall again, about the recruits who'd looked at her like she didn't belong. And for the first time, she wondered if maybe they weren't entirely wrong. Not because she wasn't strong enough, but because she'd given too much of herself to a system that only saw her strength when it needed proof. Her grandfather's voice drifted in again, uninvited. "Respect isn't given, Bryn. It's earned through action." But what happens, she wondered, when all that action leaves you empty? Weeks passed, missions stacked, names blurred. They went from raid to raid, village to village, each operation blending into the next. Bryn became the team's constant, reliable, calm, unshakable. But under that calm, something was shifting. She started to feel the distance, not just from the world she'd left behind, but from herself. The Bryn who'd once found peace in silence now found only noise, the kind that lived inside the chest, where words couldn't reach. The team noticed, Ramirez especially. "You ever take a break, LT?" he asked one night as they sat cleaning rifles in the dim light of a tent. She looked up, brow raised. "From what?" "From trying to carry the whole damn world." She smirked faintly. "That's above my pay grade." He chuckled. "You sound like you don't believe in rest." "I believe in duty," she said. "Rest comes after." Ramirez studied her for a long moment. "You remind me of someone I used to know. Guy who thought if he stopped moving, the ghosts would catch up." "Did they?" He nodded slowly. "Yeah, they always do." 2 nights later, they were wheels up again, another target, another dawn. The rhythm of it all had become hypnotic. The world outside the wire didn't exist anymore. But this mission was different. A hostage rescue, a captured aid worker held in a remote compound near Baidoa. Intel said 10 hostiles. Reality said double. The insertion was clean, low visibility, perfect weather. Bryn moved point, her breath steady beneath the night vision glow. They breached silently, flashbangs breaking the dark. Gunfire erupted almost instantly. Contact front. Bryn moved without thought, instincts running the show. She took one target clean, 2 more in rapid succession. The team advanced through the narrow hall, clearing rooms as they went. The hostage, a woman in her 30s, was found in the last room, hands bound, terrified. Bryn cut her loose, her voice calm. "You're safe. We're getting you out." The woman's eyes filled with tears. "They said you wouldn't come." Bryn offered a faint smile. They were wrong. Exfil was chaos. Gunfire chased them to the extraction zone. Helicopters thundered overhead, rotors slicing through dust and debris. Bryn covered the rear, returning fire in short, controlled bursts. When they finally lifted off, the hostage huddled between her knees, shaking. Bryn reached over, placed a hand on her shoulder. "It's over," she said softly. But deep down, she knew it never really was. Back at base, Ramirez handed her a coffee, nodded toward the flight line. "You ever think about what comes after this?" She stared at the sunrise, soft orange bleeding through the gray. "No," she said. "If I do, I might stop showing up." He smirked. "Maybe one day that's not the worst thing." She didn't answer. The truth was, she didn't know how to stop. The uniform had become her skin. The silence had become her comfort. And yet somewhere, buried under all that discipline and duty, she still felt the pull of something human. The kind of ache that no medal, no commendation, no operation could silence. She thought about her grandfather again, his worn hands, his quiet lessons, the way he moved through life like every step meant something. He taught her to be still, but also to listen. And for the first time in years, Bryn realized she'd stopped listening. To herself. That night she stood alone on the base perimeter. The African sky stretched endless and starless above her. The air smelled of sand and fuel. She closed her eyes, listened. The laughter of her team echoed faintly from the tents behind her. The sound was warm, alive, and for a brief moment she smiled. She wasn't their equal because she was a woman who'd proven herself. She was their equal because she was one of them, flawed, scarred, human. She whispered into the dark, more to herself than anyone else. "I'm still here." And maybe, for now, that was enough. They said the mission was simple. But simplicity, Bryn had learned, was just the word commanders used when they didn't want to talk about the cost. It was late January. The Horn of Africa was in its dry season, wind carving through sand like a blade through bone. SEAL Team 3 had been operating out of a forward outpost for weeks, rotating between reconnaissance and direct action missions. When the new orders came down, Bryn read them twice. Target, a suspected insurgent financier. Location, a remote village north of Kismayo. Objective, capture or eliminate. It should have been routine, but something about the intelligence brief didn't sit right. The file was thin, too thin. A grainy satellite photo, a name that barely appeared in any database, a report sourced from a local informant with unconfirmed reliability. Bryn frowned. "This feels off," she said quietly to Ramirez as they went over the plan in the makeshift operations tent. Ramirez rubbed a hand over his face. "You're not wrong, but orders are orders." "Yeah," she said, eyes narrowing, "and mistakes are still on us when they go wrong." He gave a half-smile. "You've been around long enough to know that we follow the chain of command," she finished for him. "Yeah, I know." She paused, the sound of distant rotor blades filling the silence. "But following orders doesn't mean shutting off your mind." Ramirez didn't argue. He knew her tone, calm but unyielding. They launched at 200 hours. The Black Hawk sliced through the dark, flying low over the empty desert. Bryn sat near the open door, wind tearing through her gear, night vision goggles casting the world in green light. Below, the village appeared, a scatter of mud brick houses and flickering fires. 30 seconds, the crew chief yelled. Bryn checked her weapon, nodded once, and felt that familiar stillness wash over her, the pre-mission calm that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with focus. Then they hit the ground. Boots on sand, silence, motion. They moved fast, clearing the perimeter, stacking on doorways, sweeping through rooms. Each step rehearsed, every breath measured. But something was wrong. There were no guards, no resistance, just families startled, terrified, children huddled in corners, women crying softly. Bryn's pulse slowed. "Ramirez," she whispered through comms, "this isn't a safe house. These are civilians." Static, then his voice. "Hold position, confirming target location." They pressed deeper into the village, the tension coiling like wire. In one small hut, a man in his 50s stood trembling, hands raised. "Name," Bryn barked. He said something in Somali, too fast, too panicked. One of the interpreters translated. "He's saying he's a teacher, says he doesn't know any fighters." Bryn's gut twisted. She looked around, saw books stacked in the corner, a chalkboard against the wall. Not a hideout, a schoolhouse. "Ramirez," she said again, voice sharper now. "Intel's bad, this isn't our guy." Before he could respond, another operator shouted from the next building. "We found weapons cache." Bryn moved quickly, crossing the narrow alley. Sure enough, crates, wrapped and half-buried. It didn't make sense, too convenient, too exposed. She knelt beside one crate, ran her hand over the stenciled numbers. The paint was too clean, too new. U.S. manufacture. Her stomach dropped. "These are ours," she murmured. "What?" Ramirez asked, stepping closer. "These crates, American issue. Someone staged this." The next few minutes blurred. Command over comms demanding confirmation. Ramirez arguing. Bryn standing in the center of it all, heart pounding, with something colder than fear, realization. They weren't hunting a terrorist, they were being used. When she looked outside, the faces of the villagers told the rest of the story: confusion, terror, betrayal. "Command wants us to proceed," Ramirez said, voice strained. Bryn stared at him. "Proceed with what? Arresting an innocent man." "They said we secure all combatants." "He's not a combatant." "Lieutenant," Ramirez warned, tone shifting, "that's not your call." Bryn's eyes flashed. "Then whose is it? The one who sent us in blind?" The team watched in silence. No one moved. The tension between duty and morality crackled in the air like static. For the first time in her career, Bryn hesitated. Not out of fear, but conscience. She followed every order, survived every mission, carried every scar, but she'd also sworn an oath to something higher than rank. Truth, honor, integrity. She lowered her weapon. "I'm not taking him," she said quietly. Ramirez's jaw tightened. "You're disobeying a direct order." "Then write it up," she said. "But I'm not detaining a man who teaches children and bleeds the same as us." For a long, impossible second, no one spoke. Then Ramirez sighed, the weight of command pressing into his shoulders. "Secure the site," he said finally. "We'll report questionable intel to command." Bryn exhaled slowly. Relief and dread tangled together. The after-action debrief was brutal. Command didn't like questions, especially from a woman who had the nerve to ask them out loud. Bryn sat in the sterile conference room, the hum of fluorescent lights sharp in her ears. Across from her, a row of officers, none of whom had ever been outside the wire. "Lieutenant Takakota," one of them said, Your field report indicates you chose not to detain the subject despite clear operational directives. Explain. Bryn met his gaze evenly. Because the target was not an insurgent, the intelligence was faulty. We would have been arresting a civilian. That's not for you to determine. Then for who, sir? The one's writing reports 1,000 miles away. A murmur ran through the room. The senior officer leaned forward. You're out of line, Lieutenant. With respect, sir, she said, voice low but steady, so was the mission. The silence that followed was heavy enough to break bone. Finally, another officer cleared his throat. You're dismissed, Lieutenant. She stood, saluted, and walked out without another word. That night she sat alone again, same ritual, same silence. Outside, the wind howled through the base, carrying sand and memory. She thought of her grandfather again, of the way he used to sit on the porch after a hunt, staring at the horizon for hours, saying nothing. As a child, she'd thought he was just lost in thought. Now she understood. Some silences weren't empty. They were heavy with the things you couldn't say. Days later, Ramirez found her by the docks. You made waves, he said quietly. I didn't mean to. Maybe not, but you did. He handed her a folded paper, unofficial orders, transfer request to a different unit. They're moving you stateside for a bit, he said. Command review. Bryn stared at the letter. Is this punishment or protection? He hesitated, maybe both. She nodded slowly, folded the paper, tucked it into her pocket. Ramirez, she said softly, did I do the right thing? He looked at her, the kind of look that carries more truth than words ever could. Out there, yeah, but right doesn't always play well in the system. She smiled faintly, though her eyes didn't. Story of my life. Her flight back to California was quiet. 12 hours in the dark, engine hum filling the void. She stared out the small oval window, watching the world below, desert fatting to ocean, then to cloud. She wondered what her grandfather would have said. Would he have called her brave for standing her ground, or foolish for breaking rank? Maybe both. She remembered his voice again, soft, gravelly, eternal. You can't walk straight if your compass is broken, Bryn. She smiled bitterly. Guess I just followed mine. When she landed at Coronado, she didn't go straight to quarters. She walked down to the edge of the pier instead, the Pacific stretching infinite in every direction. Waves broke against the pilings, rhythmic and relentless. She took off her cover, let the wind tangle her hair. For the first time in months, she allowed herself to breathe, really breathe. No orders, no noise, no eyes on her. Just the sound of the sea, and the quiet reminder that doing what's right often comes with a price. Maybe that's what her grandfather had meant all along, that strength wasn't about winning. It was about standing alone when the world told you to kneel. Back on base, the whispers started again. Some called her reckless, others called her righteous. She didn't care. Because somewhere deep down, beneath the exhaustion and doubt, Bryn Takakota had found something that no medal could ever represent: clarity. And in a life built on silence, that was the loudest thing she'd ever felt. She looked at the horizon one last time before heading inside, whispering to the wind not as a soldier, but as herself. Sometimes the mission isn't about who you fight, it's about what you refuse to become. When Bryn returned stateside, it wasn't to applause. There was no homecoming ceremony, no flag waving on the tarmac, no handshake waiting at the gate. Just the low hum of the airfield lights and the sound of her boots on cold concrete. The base driver met her with a quiet nod, loaded her gear into the back of a government sedan, and drove her through the empty streets of Coronado. She watched the world pass by through the tinted window, palm trees swaying in the Pacific wind, the neon glow of bars spilling laughter onto the sidewalks, life continuing like it hadn't missed her at all. 8 months overseas, and it already felt like she'd been erased. Maybe that was the point. Her reassignment papers were stamped Administrative Review. Officially, it meant she was being reevaluated for operational reintegration. Unofficially, it meant, we don't know what to do with you. The Navy didn't have a category for women like Bryn Takakota, those who had proven themselves beyond doubt, but refused to fit into the mold built for them. She was back in the same office she'd left a year earlier, liaison duty. Same walls, same clock, same faint smell of coffee and old paper. Different person. Every morning, she sat behind a desk stacked with files on training schedules and joint force logistics, busy work for a mind that had once planned missions. She wore her uniform perfectly, spoke little, and followed the rhythm of bureaucracy like a ghost rehearsing her old life. The silence was worse than gunfire. She thought coming home would bring relief. It didn't. The quiet of base housing felt like a punishment. She'd wake at 400 without meaning to, every muscle ready, every nerve listening for a sound that wasn't there. Gunfire, rotor blades, shouted commands. But there was only wind and the distant echo of waves against the breakwater. At first, she tried to fill the hours, running the beach trails until her lungs burned, lifting until her arms shook, cleaning gear that no longer saw combat. But you can't outrun silence. It follows, it waits. Some nights she sat on her porch, hands wrapped around a cup of coffee gone cold, staring out at the dark horizon. Tell herself she wasn't waiting for anything. But part of her was. Waiting for purpose. Waiting for a reason to keep showing up. 2 weeks into her reassignment, she was called into Commander Dalton's office again. He looked tired, the kind of tired that comes from too many years of decisions that never stay clean. "Lieutenant," he began, "how are you holding up?" She gave the standard answer, "Fine, sir." He smirked. That's Navy speak for barely breathing. Bryn didn't smile. Dalton sighed. "Look, Bryn, I read your debriefs. I read your field notes. You did what you thought was right out there." "I know it was right, sir," she said softly. He nodded, "And I don't disagree, but right and regulation don't always hold hands." She looked down. "So what happens now?" "For now," he said, "you stay stateside. Training Command wants you to consult on the integration program. New female candidates going through Bud S. You'd be an advisor." Bryn hesitated. "You want me to train them?" "Not train," Dalton said. "Guide, show them what it takes, show them the truth." "The truth?" "That it's not about gender," he said. "It's about grit, discipline, balance. The kind that's earned, not demanded." She nodded slowly. "And if they're not ready?" He gave a thin smile. "Then they'll quit, same as the men." Bryn left the office with the papers in hand, unsure whether it felt like a punishment or a second chance. Her first day at the Bud S training compound felt like walking back into another life. The sound of shouting, the crash of surf, the clang of metal on metal, it all hit her like déjà vu. The candidates lined up on the beach, young, raw, terrified. Among them 4 women. Bryn stood off to the side, sunglasses hiding the sharpness of her gaze. She didn't introduce herself right away. She just watched. One of the instructors, an older chief, leaned over. "Hard to believe, huh? We never thought we'd see women out here." Bryn tilted her head slightly. "You didn't think you'd see one finish either, but here we are." He chuckled, "Fair." Later that afternoon, she walked along the sand where the candidates were dragging logs through the surf. The women were near the back, slower, struggling but refusing to quit. She stopped beside them, kneeling in the wet sand. One of the trainees looked up, gasping for air. "Ma'am, do you have any advice?" Bryn studied her, mud on her face, exhaustion in her eyes, but still pushing. "Don't try to prove anything," Bryn said quietly. "Just finish the next minute." The woman blinked. "That's it." Bryn smiled faintly. "That's everything." That night back in her quarters, Bryn thought about what she'd said. Just finish the next minute. It had been her mantra once, in the freezing surf, in the endless runs, in the silence between gunfire. But now, she wasn't sure what minute she was working toward. She was existing, not living. Following orders, not believing in them. She pulled the trident from her drawer and set it on the table. It caught the lamplight, gleaming like it always had. 3 years ago, it had meant everything. Now it just reminded her of how far she'd come, and how much she'd lost along the way. 2 weeks later, a letter arrived. No name on the envelope, just an address from Washington State. Inside was a small, handwritten note from her younger brother. The ranch feels empty without him. Grandpa's tools are still in the shed. I found one of his old journals he wrote about you. Said he always knew you'd carry the weight better than most. Said you were the calm in the storm. I think he meant it literally. Bryn folded the letter carefully, pressing it against her chest. She hadn't been home since the funeral. She hadn't let herself go back. But now the thought lingered like a whisper she couldn't ignore. Maybe it was time. The following weekend, she requested 3 days leave. When she arrived in Colville, the land felt smaller, not because it had changed, but because she had. The house stood quiet, still painted the same faded green, still smelling faintly of cedar and gun oil. She walked the property slowly, boots crunching against frost. The forest behind the house was exactly as she remembered, tall pines, brittle wind, and silence that wasn't empty, but full. Inside the shed, dust covered everything: tools, old photos, forgotten years. On the workbench lay a small, weathered rifle. Her first one. She picked it up, ran her hand along the stock, and closed her eyes. In that moment, she could almost hear his voice again. You breathe with the earth, you don't fight it. Her chest tightened. The Navy had taught her to fight. But her grandfather had taught her to listen. Maybe she'd spent too many years forgetting which lesson mattered more. That night she sat on the porch wrapped in an old blanket, the stars clear and sharp above. No engines, no gunfire, no orders, just wind through trees and the soft hum of the earth turning. She thought about everything she'd done, every mission, every choice, every silence she'd carried. And she wondered if maybe this was what her grandfather had meant by peace, not the absence of war, just the presence of understanding. When she returned to Coronado, she wasn't healed, not fully. But something inside her had settled. She started showing up at the Bud-S compound earlier, staying later. She didn't lecture or preach, she demonstrated. How to move, how to breathe, how to lead without shouting. The recruits began to respect her quietly, the same way she'd once earned her own respect, through action. One afternoon, one of the younger female candidates stopped her near the docks. "Ma'am," she said shyly, "is it true you were the first?" Bryn smiled faintly. "One of the first." The girl hesitated. Was it worth it? Bryn looked out toward the water, sunlight breaking against the waves, gulls circling above. She didn't answer right away. Finally she said, "Worth it, every inch, but it'll cost you something you don't get back." The girl frowned. "What's that?" Bryn looked at her, eyes steady. "The part of you that thinks you can do this and stay the same." The recruit nodded slowly, as if she understood or wanted to. Bryn watched her walk away, the wind tugging at her hair, and for the first time in months she felt something she hadn't felt since Syria. Hope. Not loud, not bright, but enough. That night she stood again by the pier, same as she had after every storm. The ocean stretched endless before her, moonlight breaking across the water. Her reflection stared back, not the woman who'd once needed to prove herself, but the one who finally knew who she was. A soldier, a teacher, a survivor. She whispered into the wind, as if speaking to someone she still believed could hear her. "I'm still earning it, Grandpa." The waves answered softly, endless and sure. Sometimes the hardest battles aren't fought overseas. They're fought in the silence after. And sometimes, winning just means learning how to live again. By spring, Coronado had begun to feel alive again, the kind of alive that only comes after long months of fog and memory. The sun burned brighter over the Pacific, and the air carried the smell of salt and jet fuel. For most people, it was just another season. For Bryn Takakota, it felt like a fragile truce between two lives. She was no longer deployed, no longer buried in the rhythm of operations and danger. But she wasn't at peace either. She existed in the space between the quiet after the war but before the healing. Every morning she showed up at the training compound at dawn. She'd walk the beach while the candidates hit the surf, shouting, sweating, pushing through exhaustion. She didn't need to yell. Her presence was enough. Sometimes one of the instructors would say, "They fear her more than Hell Week." Bryn never corrected them. Fear wasn't what she wanted to inspire. What she wanted was something rarer, respect, earned not through words but through example. It was during one of those mornings that she noticed something, a candidate struggling harder than the rest. Petty Officer Cole Matthews, 23, from Kentucky. Strong, athletic, but reckless. Too much fire, not enough control. He reminded her of the men from that mess hall years ago, loud, overconfident, convinced the world owed him victory. That kind of energy burned bright, then burned out. During a team evolution, Matthews snapped at one of the women in his boat crew, yelling that she was slowing them down. The instructor was about to step in, but Bryn raised a hand. "Let him talk," she said quietly. When the drill ended, Matthews collapsed in the sand, chest heaving. Bryn walked over, crouched beside him. "You done?" she asked. He looked up, still breathing hard. "Ma'am," she couldn't keep up. Bryn's tone was calm, but her eyes were sharp. "Maybe not, but leadership isn't about who breaks first. It's about who helps the others not to." Matthews wiped sweat from his forehead. "With respect, ma'am, this isn't about feelings. It's about surviving." She leaned closer. "You think I don't know that?" His face changed, the recognition sinking in, the name clicking. "Lieutenant Takakota." "The SEAL," he murmured. Bryn stood. "I'm not a title, Matthews. I'm a reminder. You want to survive. Learn the difference between pride and purpose." Then she turned and walked away, leaving him in the sand, confused, ashamed. And though he'd never admit it, changed. That night, the training compound buzzed with whispers. The recruits had started talking about her again. They called her the ghost of Hell Week. Some said she never slept. Others said she'd once gone 3 days without eating during combat. Rumors had always followed her. She used to hate them. Now she let them live. Because behind every myth was a seed of truth. And if those stories pushed someone to dig deeper, she didn't mind carrying their superstition. Weeks passed. The candidates got stronger, leaner, sharper. Bryn watched them grow, and with each passing day, she began to see something shift inside herself. It wasn't pride, it was renewal. She'd spent years proving she belonged. Now she was showing others that they could. But peace for her was always temporary. It happened on a Wednesday, one of those bright, ordinary days that starts like any other before everything tilts. Bryn was heading back from the docks when she heard it, shouting near the obstacle course, the kind that carried panic. She broke into a run. When she reached the course, she saw Matthews, the same recruit from weeks earlier, lying flat on his back in the sand. Blood ran from his temple. Another candidate was kneeling beside him, shouting for a medic. Bryn dropped to her knees. "What happened?" "He fell from the rope tower 30 feet up," someone said. Bryn pressed her hand to his neck, pulse faint but there. His eyes fluttered. "Stay with me, Cole," she said, voice firm. "Look at me, you're not done yet." The medics arrived moments later, loading him onto a stretcher. Bryn stood there, watching as the helicopter lifted off. And just like that, the air grew still again, the calm that always follows chaos. She knew it too well. That evening, Bryn sat alone by the docks, the ocean glowing under the dying light. The rhythmic pulse of waves against the pier reminded her of heartbeats, steady, fragile, mortal. She couldn't shake the image of Matthews falling. She'd seen death before more times than she could count, but this was different. This was supposed to be safe ground, a place of growth, not loss. Dalton found her there. "Word travels fast," he said quietly. "How's he doing?" "Stable, fractured ribs, concussion, he'll live." Bryn exhaled, relief, guilt, both at once. Dalton studied her face. "You know it's not your fault, right?" "I was 10 feet away," she said softly. "If I'd seen him climb wrong." "You can't save everyone, Lieutenant." Bryn looked out at the horizon. "Then why does it feel like I should try?" Dalton didn't answer. He just stood beside her, hands in his pockets, watching the same waves she did. "You ever think about leaving all this behind?" he asked after a long silence. "Every day," she said, "and every day I remember why I can't." He nodded. "Some of us are built for the storm, Bryn. We don't know what to do when it passes." She smiled faintly. "Maybe, but even storms fade eventually." Days later, Matthews returned to the compound on crutches. Bryn found him sitting near the bleachers, staring out at the recruits training in the surf. "Most people would take more time off," she said, sitting beside him. He shrugged. "Guess I didn't want to quit." "You didn't," she said. "You got hurt." He looked at her, frustration in his eyes. "Feels the same." Bryn watched the water for a while before speaking. "When I was in Syria, a teammate got hit during an ambush. I blamed myself for months, thought if I'd moved faster, looked harder, maybe he'd still be alive." "What changed?" he asked. She turned toward him. "I realized that carrying guilt doesn't honor the fallen, it just buries the living." He nodded slowly, absorbing that. "You ever get used to it, the weight?" Bryn smiled faintly. "No, you just learn to balance it." Weeks passed. Matthews recovered enough to rejoin light training. Bryn watched him closely, not as an officer evaluating performance, but as someone who'd seen what resilience looked like when it wasn't pretty. The other recruits noticed too. Matthews stopped shouting. He started listening, leading differently. Change isn't loud, it's subtle, quiet, the kind that moves like a tide. And Bryn felt something shift in herself as well, pride, not in her own strength, but in the way her lessons were starting to ripple outward. For the first time in years, she wasn't carrying her story alone. One afternoon, she received a letter from Ramirez, now stationed in Bahrain. "Heard you're training the next generation," it read. "I guess the storm finally found its calm. Don't lose it. The world still needs people like you, the ones who remember that strength without mercy is just violence." Bryn folded the letter and smiled. Ramirez had always known how to say the things she didn't know she needed to hear. Maybe, she thought, that was what leadership really meant. Not control, not rank, just the courage to remember humanity when the world forgot. That night, the sunset painted the horizon in gold and fire. The recruits were finishing their final week before phase transition. Bryn stood near the surf, hands behind her back, watching them move through exhaustion toward something greater. They didn't see her wipe the tear that slipped down her cheek, the kind that wasn't sorrow, but gratitude. The water glowed around them, the same water that had once nearly broken her. Now it reflected something different, legacy. Later, as the compound quieted, she walked to the far end of the pier. The air was cool, the sea restless. She leaned on the railing, staring at the faint shimmer of the moon over the waves. Her reflection stared back, older now, softer but unbroken. She spoke softly, as if someone was listening. "You were right, Grandpa, respect isn't given, but it's not just earned either. It's taught, one quiet act at a time." The wind carried her words out to sea. And somewhere in that endless expanse of water and memory, Bryn Takakota finally felt what she'd been chasing for years. Not redemption, not glory. Peace. Peace has a fragile heartbeat. It lasts only until the world remembers your name. Bryn Takakota had almost started to believe in normalcy again. Sunrise runs, training sessions, quiet nights by the ocean. The world outside her small corner of Coronado felt distant, like a dream she'd already lived. But peace doesn't last long in a life built on war. It was early June when the storm returned, not the kind made of weather, but the kind made of men. The first sign came in the form of a phone call. She was walking back from the gym, the morning light sharp and clean, when her cell buzzed in her pocket. "Lieutenant Takakota," the voice said, "this is Base Command. We need you at Training Compound Bravo immediately." Bryn stopped walking. "What's going on?" "Security breach. Possible armed intruder. You're the senior officer closest to the site." Her heart didn't race. It slowed, the way it always did when chaos whispered her name. "On my way," she said. By the time she reached the compound, the air had already shifted, tense, electric. The recruits were being evacuated to the north side of the field. Instructors were shouting orders, radios buzzing with overlapping voices. Bryn pushed through the crowd, her tone cutting through the noise. "Report." A petty officer turned toward her, sweat streaking his face. "Ma'am, someone breached the south gate. Civilian vehicle. Security tried to stop it. Shots fired." "Shots fired?" "Yes, ma'am. We've got one guard down, possibly wounded. Suspects armed and moving toward the obstacle course." Bryn scanned the area. The compound stretched wide, too many blind spots, too many places to hide. "Lock down the perimeter," she ordered. "No one moves until I say." The petty officer hesitated. "Ma'am, protocol says wait for." She cut him off. "Protocol already broken, move." He went. Bryn drew her sidearm, an old SIG P320 she hadn't touched in months, and moved low along the wall of the admin building. The air smelled of dust and cordite. Somewhere in the distance, a gull screamed, that strange reminder that the world never stops, even when danger arrives. She moved quietly, scanning corners, footsteps silent. The training field ahead was empty, too empty. Then she saw movement, a figure near the tower ropes, hunched, carrying something metallic that caught the sunlight. She crouched behind a crate, radio whispering static in her ear. "Command, I have visual. One suspect male, armed. No badge, no uniform." "Copy, Lieutenant. SWAT en route. ETA 10 minutes." 10 minutes too long. The man was packing now, agitated, muttering under his breath. Bryn could hear fragments, names, curses, something about revenge. She took a slow breath. The Navy had trained her for this 100 times over, but this wasn't a battlefield, it was home. And that made it worse. She stepped out from cover. "Sir, drop the weapon." The man spun around, eyes wild, shotgun in hand. "Don't," he shouted. "Stay back." Bryn kept her stance calm, centered. "No one needs to get hurt. Put it down." "They lied to me," he yelled. "You people took everything, my brother, my life." His voice cracked, full of pain that ran deeper than anger. "Who's your brother?" she asked, keeping her tone low, steady. He blinked, confused by her calm. "Bud trainee, 2 years ago, died in training. You covered it up." Bryn's stomach twisted. She remembered. A candidate had drowned during a dive exercise, a tragedy that haunted everyone who'd been there. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "I was there. It wasn't covered up. We lost him too." "Liar," he screamed, raising the shotgun. She didn't flinch. "I knew his name, Tyler Hayes. He was strong, brave. No one forgot him." His breath hitched. The barrel wavered. "Put the weapon down," she said again, softer now. "You don't want to do this. I know what it's like to lose someone to the ocean. It doesn't take mercy, and it doesn't return what it takes." The man hesitated, trembling, eyes glassy. And then footsteps. Two security officers burst from the far side of the course, weapons drawn. "Drop it," they yelled. The man spun, panicked, finger tightening on the trigger. Time fractured. Bryn moved before she thought, years of training collapsing into one perfect, violent second. She lunged, grabbed the barrel, twisted. A single shot exploded into the dirt beside them. She drove her shoulder into his chest, disarming him with a practiced motion. The shotgun clattered across the sand. The man fell to his knees, gasping. The officers rushed in, cuffing him as he sobbed. Bryn stood there, chest rising, adrenaline cold in her veins. The smell of gunpowder hung heavy in the air. She looked down at her hands, steady still. She hadn't lost it. But she'd hoped she'd never need it again. Later, the base was silent again. The suspect was taken into custody. The wounded guard survived. Bryn gave her statement, then walked out to the pier, uniform still dusty from the sand. The ocean stretched dark and endless, the horizon glowing faintly with the setting sun. Dalton found her there again. "I should have known you'd be the one to handle it," he said. Bryn didn't turn. "It's never supposed to happen here." "No," Dalton said softly, "but when it does, I'm glad it was you." She looked at him, eyes tired but clear. He wasn't a terrorist, he was broken. "Most are," Dalton said, "just different kinds of broken." She nodded slowly. "He lost his brother. I lost a part of myself out there. We're all just trying to make sense of what's left." Dalton sighed, the sound of an old soldier who understood too well. "You ever wish you chosen another life?" Bryn smiled faintly. "Sometimes, then I remember I didn't choose it, it chose me." That night she couldn't sleep. She sat in her quarters, the room lit only by the moonlight spilling through the window. On her desk lay the trident, gleaming faintly, like it was still watching her. She thought about the man on the course, about the pain in his voice, the way he looked at her like she was both enemy and savior. And she realized something that froze her heart. In another lifetime, that could have been her. If not for her grandfather, if not for the lessons that kept her steady when the world tore itself apart. She whispered into the stillness, "I hear you, Grandpa, I still hear you." The wind rattled the blinds gently, like an answer. The next morning, the recruits were quiet during muster. Word had spread, the story of what had happened, how she'd faced down an armed intruder without firing a shot. Matthews, the young recruit she'd mentored, stepped forward after formation. "Ma'am," he said cautiously, "we heard about yesterday." Bryn glanced at him. "You hear a lot of things." "Yes, ma'am, but this one's true, right? You stopped him." She paused, then nodded once. Matthews swallowed. "How did you not freeze?" Bryn studied him, her tone even. "Because fear's not the enemy, panic is. Fear's a tool if you know how to hold it." He nodded, eyes wide with quiet awe. Then she added softly, "And sometimes the mission isn't about defeating someone. It's about saving what's left of them." Matthews nodded again, understanding more than words could teach. After formation, she walked the beach alone. The surf was calm, sunlight turning the water to silver. She stopped near the edge, boots sinking into wet sand, and closed her eyes. The world was quiet again, but this time the quiet didn't hurt. It reminded her of balance, the kind her grandfather taught her as a girl. The stillness between breath and movement. The pause between storm and peace. She smiled faintly. Maybe this was what all the years had been leading toward, not recognition, not vindication, but understanding. That the hardest battles aren't the ones you fight out loud. They're the ones you fight quietly, inside yourself, every day you wake up and choose not to give up. That evening, Dalton called her into his office. "They're talking about a commendation," he said, "for yesterday." Bryn frowned. "I don't need one." "I know," he said with a grin. "That's why you deserve it." She chuckled softly, shaking her head. I just did what needed to be done. Dalton nodded. That's what makes you who you are. She turned to leave, then paused. Sir. Yes, Lieutenant. If it's all right, I'd like to stay at the compound a little longer. Help this next class finish Hell Week. Dalton smiled. I was hoping you'd say that. That night, as the sun fell over the Pacific and the candidates crawled through cold surf, Bryn Takakota stood at the shoreline, the same way she once had, years ago, when she was one of them. The waves crashed, the wind howled, and the recruits shouted through exhaustion. She watched them, arms crossed, the surf soaking her boots. One of the instructors glanced at her. You miss it. She smiled, that small, knowing smile of someone who's seen both war and peace and learned the price of each. Sometimes, she said, but I don't need to be in the surf to feel it. The instructor chuckled. Feel what? She looked out at the ocean, vast, merciless, eternal. The storm, she said. It never really leaves you. You just learn to live with the calm it leaves behind. As the last light faded, Bryn closed her eyes and whispered one final truth into the wind. Sometimes, strength isn't found in the fight, but in the choice to stop fighting. And for the first time in years, the storm inside her was silent. The sun rose slow over Coronado, painting the Pacific in gold. It was one of those mornings when everything looked deceptively peaceful, the kind that almost made you forget how much the world had taken from you to earn that calm. Bryn Takakota stood on the pier, hands resting lightly on the railing, the breeze lifting strands of her hair. The ocean stretched out before her like a mirror, endless and unjudging. It had been nearly 6 months since the day of the intrusion, 6 months since she'd stepped back into the storm and walked out unchanged, but not untouched. The base had quieted since then. New candidates had come through, new faces with the same hungry eyes, the same belief that toughness was noise and pain was glory. She'd been there for every graduation, standing at the edge of the parade deck, uniform crisp, eyes steady, never clapping, never cheering, just watching. That was her way. This morning felt different, though. Something final hung in the air. Her orders had arrived the night before reassignment. Naval Special Warfare Command, Washington, D.C. Training policy and integration strategy. Desk work. Paper instead of sand. Meetings instead of missions. For most, it would be a promotion. For her, it felt like a goodbye. Still, she didn't fight it. She spent too many years fighting everything. Some battles weren't meant to be won, just carried until they taught you something. The sound of footsteps broke her thoughts. Figured I'd find you here, Dalton said, walking up beside her. She smiled faintly. It's quieter than the office. He nodded. You always did prefer the view out here. Bryn looked out at the horizon. It reminds me that the world's bigger than whatever I'm wrestling with. Dalton leaned on the railing beside her. You ready for D.C.? I'm ready for something, she said softly. Whether that's it or not, we'll find out. He chuckled. You know, Takakota, I've met a lot of operators in my time, men who could break steel with their hands, who thought fear was weakness. But you. I was just too stubborn to quit, she said with a small grin. No, Dalton replied quietly. You were brave enough to stay human. That's rarer than strength. She turned her head slightly, meeting his gaze. Sometimes I think that's what makes it harder. Maybe, he said, but it's also what makes it matter. She walked the compound one last time that afternoon. The recruits were mid-training, log PT on the beach, salt spray in their eyes, the Pacific punishing and holy as ever. The air was thick with sweat and shouting, but she heard something beneath it, the rhythm, the heartbeat of every SEAL who'd ever come through this place. She stopped beside Matthews, now in his final phase. He looked older, sharper, the arrogance burned out, replaced by calm. Ma'am, he said, snapping to attention. At ease, petty officer, she said. You look stronger. Trying to be, he said with a grin. She tilted her head. You'll make it. You learn the one thing most people never do. What's that? That strength isn't about what you can carry, she said. It's about what you choose to put down. He nodded slowly, understanding dawning in his eyes. When she turned to leave, he called after her, "Ma'am." She glanced back. "Thank you," he said simply. Bryn smiled. "Don't thank me yet, you haven't finished Hell Week." He laughed, and in that laughter, she heard something she hadn't heard in years, hope that sounded genuine. That evening, she began packing her quarters. The walls were bare, the shelves almost empty, except for one object sitting at the center of her desk, the trident. She stared at it for a long time, the way you stare at an old wound that healed but never forgot the scar. When she'd earned it, it had felt like the beginning of everything. Now it felt like the sum of it. Not an award. A burden. A reminder of what it cost to become the thing the world said you couldn't be. She picked it up, turned it in her fingers. The gold gleamed against her skin. She remembered the weight of the sand during Bud S, the sound of instructors screaming over the surf, the cold that bit through her bones, the faces she'd outlasted, the names she'd lost. All for this one small symbol. She set it down again, not with reverence but with peace. As the sun dipped below the horizon, she walked out to the beach. The tide was low, the air thick with salt and memory. For a long moment she just stood there, watching the waves roll in and out, their rhythm older than war, older than pain. She thought of her grandfather again, his voice, his hands, the lessons that had carried her through every storm. You breathe with the earth, you don't fight it. She closed her eyes, breath deep, and whispered, "I finally understand." Because all this time she'd been fighting everything, expectations, judgment, the system, even herself. But maybe the point was never to fight. Maybe it was to endure, to move through the storm without letting it define you. A week later, she boarded the flight to D.C. No fanfare, no farewell ceremony, just another quiet departure. She sat by the window, watching the California coastline fall away beneath her, the same waves that had shaped her, tested her, and in some way saved her. Somewhere over the Rockies, she took out her brother's letter, the one about their grandfather's journal. She unfolded it slowly, tracing the words with her fingers. "He said you were the calm in the storm." She smiled softly. "Maybe I finally am." Washington was gray and cold when she arrived, concrete and order, a city that thrived on silence disguised as power. Her office was small, the view forgettable, but on her desk she placed one thing, the trident. Not as a trophy, as a memory. Every day, young officers and analysts would walk past her door, some curious, some skeptical, few brave enough to ask. And sometimes, when the right one did, she'd tell them a story about a mess hall in Coronado, about a lesson learned in silence, about what it means to fight without hatred, to lead without noise. They'd listen, wide-eyed, expecting heroism. She never gave them that. She just gave them truth. One afternoon, months later, she was walking past the memorial wall at the Pentagon, rows of names etched in cold stone, each one a life that had carried the same weight she knew too well. She stopped when she reached one name, Tyler Hayes, the brother of the man she'd disarmed. She reached out, touched the carving with her fingertips. "I met him," she whispered. "He was lost, but I think he found peace too." The reflection of her uniform glimmered faintly in the polished surface, older now, quieter. She straightened her posture and saluted. Then she walked away, the echo of her footsteps soft against the marble. That night, back in her apartment, she wrote a letter to the next class of SEAL candidates, something that would be read aloud at their orientation. It wasn't long, just a few lines. "You'll be tested, you'll bleed, you'll break, but the real battle isn't in the water or the sand. It's in the silence after, when no one's watching, when there's nothing left to prove. That's where you find who you really are. That's where you earn it. She signed it simply. LT, Bryn Takakota, U.S. Navy SEAL. Then she folded it neatly and set it aside. Outside, the night over Washington was quiet, no waves, no surf, no shouting, just the low hum of the city breathing. Bryn sat by the window, staring out at the faint glow of streetlights. She thought of all the versions of herself that had walked this path: the girl who hunted with her grandfather, the trainee in the freezing surf, the soldier in Syria, the woman in the mess hall who refused to bow. Each one had carried the same heart, just hidden under different layers of armor. Now, finally, she didn't need the armor anymore. She took the trident from her desk one last time and set it beside her on the windowsill. The gold caught the glow of the city lights, faint and steady. She whispered into the quiet, voice barely a breath. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak, it simply acts. The wind outside shifted gently, brushing against the glass like an unseen acknowledgement. And for the first time in years, maybe ever, Bryn Takakota allowed herself to rest. Not because she was finished, but because she'd finally learned that peace isn't something you find. It's something you choose again and again, every day, even when the world forgets your name. The city kept moving. The ocean kept breathing. And somewhere in between them, a quiet woman who had walked through war finally understood what it meant to be free.